problems in Blackboard. And in short, there's a giant flaw with Blackboard.
Uh-oh.
There's probably a lot of them, but this is a big one. This is a big one to us. We used to do things in Angel and we lost everything. And part of this I got figured out, and then I applied for a SUNY IITG grant to put together tutorial materials. And so the handout I've given you is the initial outline of everything that I'm going to put together. We'll talk through some of it today. I'll show you some examples. I'll also be interested in any feedback of, wait a minute, you need to include this, things that I'm missing. Jeff Schneider and I have started talking about some best practices of how to organize all these questions that we create. And for those of you that aren't familiar with questions and such in Blackboard, the first thing I want to do is in your course, in the left menu is Course Tools. Oh, and that's in the pen. And in the Course Tools, down towards the bottom, is the Tests, Surveys, and Pools.
Where is that? Test, surveys, and pools?
Tests, Surveys, and Pools.
So go to your Course Tools.
So it's in the Course Tools, and it's near almost the bottom of the list.
Course management?
No?
Oh, course tools, got it.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
So, a couple things. Tests are sets of questions that you're going to deploy to students, either quiz or homework or tests or whatever. Surveys you can deploy, but they're anonymous and done very little with those. Pools are what I found I do most of my work with at this level of development. Pools are sets of questions. And you can have different questions within a pool, or you can have a whole bunch of variations of a question in a pool. What I'm going to be talking about a lot today are with the pools, and it's going to be making a set of questions where numbers change and making that a pool to choose from.
So you can think of the old school question bank.
Yeah.
Publishers used to.
Question bank.
You just lost me, because so the difference between tests and the pool is the pool you have.
The only
You can
difference
have
is
groups of tests, groups of questions and tests as well, right?
you can. Tests are directly deployable to the students.
Okay.
Okay. Pools are not.
Oh.
It's a question bank.
Oh, okay, got it.
There's also a subtlety in that questions you have in a test can only be deployed in one test. Questions that you have in a pool can be used anywhere as many times as you want. Pools are much more versatile.
Cool.
You'll create tests to give students, but you want everything really in your pools. And I'll click on pools to show you what you would do is build a pool, and then you can start populating it with questions. I have chosen to use very long, descriptive names for a lot of my pools, just because I'm sharing questions with other people, and it makes it clear what is that set of questions about. And I've largely used my pools to have all the same kind of question, it's just the numbers that are changing within those questions. So I don't mix up questions within the pool. An important part here is you can import pools. So if I've written questions and saved them in class A, I can bring those into a different course, class B.
But it has to be another pool, it can't be a test.
You can import tests around as well. But the important difference is, or the important thing to keep in mind, you have to pull tests, pools, questions. You have to pull them into your Blackboard shell. You can't go out and find them. You have to export them from wherever you are, save them to your local computer, and then pull them into the new Blackboard shell. So that's a step that we didn't used to have to do. You can't push them from class A into class B. You have to actually pull them. Okay? I'm going to hop back to the tests. No, I'll stay in pools. So in pools, we can build a pool, give it a name, and then once you build the pool and you've given it a name, now you can start creating questions. You can go out and find questions from other pools or other tests, or you can upload questions. And ultimately, with what I show you guys today, upload questions will be what you do. But it's good to see where we are at this point. And it's good to look at what this create question is to talk about a couple of things. So if I go over to create question and hover over it, there's a whole bunch of question possibilities. I have not even begun to explore all of these. I've focused mostly on understanding numeric questions and numeric multiple choice questions. So we've got calculated formula, calculated numeric. There's also a multiple choice. I'm going to leave everything else undiscussed right now. But calculated formula versus calculated numeric. A calculated formula question allows you to write the question, have variables. You can set a range for those variables, and then you can tell Blackboard how many iterations it should make. So quickly, so we can say, what is the area of a rectangle? If I could spell.
You can, you just can't type.
That is some length in inches by some width in inches. Writing this question, you have to put your variable in square brackets, which creates other problems in chemistry because we use square brackets for notation. So you write this, and then you can write a formula here that will calculate that answer. And so in this case, it would be L times W, my two variables. Pretty simple. One thing that I have discovered is that although this looks nice and clean in this box, don't prove me wrong, please don't prove me wrong.
I know, right?
If you look at, it's proving me wrong.
Don't worry.
The HTML,
Give it time.
the language programming is clean. A lot of the time this is a mess.
Yes, yes.
It's a disaster. To the point where I actually write in HTML directly to
Well,
avoid the mess.
Especially when you were deleting and adding and go, that's usually when it.
Yeah. So I've written my question, I've written my formula. Now I can say, what kind of a tolerance do I want to give students? Plus or minus an inch, plus or minus 2 inches, or, so that would be numeric, or I can do it within a percent. So I could say, accept answers that are within 5%. You can do partial credit and give it a bigger tolerance. So if they get within 20%, they get some of the points. I have not done anything with requiring units. There's too many different ways for students to write units that it just creates frustration. And so when we go to next here, now we get a screen where we can define our variable ranges. And so we can say, well, it's going to be somewhere between 1 and 5 inches there, 0.5 and 0.8 inches here. You can tell it how many decimal places you want it to do. And then you tell it how many answers to calculate. This way I said it creates some number of iterations. So we can tell it how many decimal places to calculate the answer to, and then how many to calculate. Right now it's going to calculate 10 possibilities. Let's make this just 2 decimal places, and it can be a normal number or it can be exponential scientific notation. And we'll say next or calculate. And so what it's done is it's created 10 sets of variables and 10 correct answers with 5% tolerance. And then we can say, yeah, those all look like they're reasonable numbers. I'm happy with those. Save it as a question. And so when we do that, it goes into our pool as one question, but built into that one question are really 10 sets of values. All right? So that's not too bad. That's kind of nice. Except, you notice my equation, my answer, I can only write one equation. Blackboard only allows one dependent variable. So what it means is if you want some numbers to build off from other variables, you can't do it. The other thing is if you have a really complicated problem with a lot of steps, you have to write it as a single line equation for Blackboard to do all the steps in one shot. And so you could end up with a long, complicated problem that you have, oh, I don't know, a dozen different operations that you've got to get set up in that single equation. It's doable, but there's limits. I have a 500, 800 sets of values. It will do a very large number if you really want it to. It takes a little time sometimes, but there doesn't seem to be a limit to how many sets of values you can create in a calculated formula question.
Casey, do you know if there are any student impacts on the extreme end of presenting that many variables? So for instance, the question contains 800 different
Iterations.
Iterations, thank you. Does it impact rendering time for students because it's potentially in the background drawing from 800 renderings?
I don't know. I don't think so, but I've never really done it. I've pretty much been limiting myself to 40 or 50 questions, figuring that, or 40 or 50 iterations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, occasionally I think I might have had 100 iterations, but
I've done 150 and it seems to be okay.
Okay.
The nice thing with calculated formula is it's one question in your pool, and it accounts for all those iterations. But we have these other limits. That's where using calculated numeric comes into play. So if I go and try and write a calculated numeric question, it's going to look just about the same, except I don't have any variables now. I have to actually write in the values, that it's 3 inches by 4 inches. And then I have to actually tell it that it's a correct answer of 12. And I can still put a tolerance in, but I have to do this by hand for every iteration that I want. You know, there's places to put in feedback then, and I can submit. And so now I have that question in my pool, but every student's going to get the same numbers. What I've figured out is a way to write calculated numeric questions using spreadsheets. You can make them into a text file, and then you can upload that text file of questions into the pool. And so once you have it in Excel, you can copy it 50 rows. It gives you 50 questions. Make the text file, upload it, now you have a 50 pool or 50 question pool with all different numbers. It's also how you would do multiple choice questions if you wanted numeric answers in your multiple choice. Because you can set up Excel to calculate those correct multiple choice response and incorrect multiple choice responses. And then bring that over as multiple choice questions. So, how do you do this? It took me a while to figure this out, but I'm getting there. The first thing you really want to do is use a text editor to write your question. So let me just open Notepad. So if you've got a question, I know Tom wrote down some earlier because I asked him to. Which I've already written one of them just to think ahead a little bit. So just so everybody can kind of see this. Here's a question out of chemistry. Question, you get some chemical reaction. The key thing is you're going to present the student with a delta H value, a delta S value. You present them with a temperature value, and all you have to do then is plug it into this equation and get your answer. So what I'll do is I'll write this question in the text editor. I'll probably leave the equation out right now just to make life a little easier. But our question's going to be something like, that's fine.
You notice he's using HTML
Right.
in his text file.
Yes, I was going to comment about that in a second, but
Comment on that. Even though you're not working in the HTML editor per se, right? In the text editor.
Yeah.
right.
We used to do HTML.
Oh, I know.
So I've written a calculate energy change for a reaction at temperature K when delta H equals some value in kilojoules per mole and delta S is equal to some value in joules per Kelvin mole. So my temperature I want to be variable. I have chosen for simplicity to use the left curly bracket as a delimiter, just to set off what I want to be a variable. And you'll see why I do this. Not the square brackets that Blackboard likes to do, because we use those. I use the curly bracket. And I use the left curly bracket for both, on both ends.
Yeah.
So it's the same delimiter. It's the same symbol. And I'll put it on both sides of everything I want to be a variable. And you can put a variable name there, or you can just leave a blank space. Don't put them right next to each other, though. So once I've written this, I can take this text, I'm going to copy it, and I can open up a spreadsheet file, whether it's Google Sheets or Excel or numbers, doesn't really matter. There's a few differences in how you do things in Sheets and Excel, but what I'm going to do is not paste my first column. I'm going to come way over here to F or G, and I'm going to paste my text question into that cell. What I want to do now is split the text of my question up so that the variables have their own column. And if you had to sit here and write, which I did initially, part of a question, then a blank column for a variable, then part of a question, there's an easier way. In Excel, there's a function called convert to text, convert text to columns. It does it automatically based on the delimiter. In Sheets, it's an equation. This is the only equation I've found that is in Sheets that doesn't work in Excel. But the equation is, you do an equals, the equation is split, and I'm going to split my cell with the text based on the delimiter of a curly bracket and hit enter. And so there's the first part of my question, there's my variable, the next part of my text, the variable, the next part of my text, the variable, the end of the question. So it does it for you. Splits it out. And so then down this way, I need to establish what those variable values are. I use the random between equation in Excel, which allows you to select, or it randomly generates an integer between whatever limit you give it. Key thing is integer. If you want it with decimals, you pick a bigger integer and divide it by some factor of tens. So, oh, I don't know, let's do this between 10,000 and 90,000, and then I'm going to divide this by 10. So I get a number somewhere between 1,000 and 9,000 with one decimal place. So that maybe is my delta H value. I can do the same thing for the delta S value, except those numbers are usually a little smaller, so we'll do between 1,000 and 9,000 divided by 10. And then we need to do temperature. So we'll do random between, oh, I don't know, let's say.
No, it's gonna break on.
You got an extra W, or you're ready to select it.
Yeah. If you just select when it suggests the formula and you click on it, then you don't have to worry about mistyping.
The W and T or.
Yeah, just grab, there you go. There.
So we'll do between 200 and 350 divided by 100. So, and notice every time I hit enter, those numbers change, because every time you do a new calculation, the numbers change. But I've got my three variables there now that I need to deal with, and then I can write an equation that actually calculates the answer, which is going to be this number minus this number times this number divided by 1,000. It's really good to do these things on paper first, so you kind of got one worked out, but now I have my three variables. I have something that's calculating an answer. I'm going to guess that that answer is correct. So I want to be sure those numbers end up in the right columns. And so I'm going to grab the temperature value. Oh. Well, that's an interesting one. Okay. It's an equation. And so when I fix one of those cells, it broke the original equation. So I just learned something that I have to do. I need to copy that and paste it just as values. So now I can put those equations in. So, one thing I'll have to make sure I do. So I've got the first part of my text question, the variable, the next part of text, the variable, the next part of text, the value, the last part of the text. So now what I want to do is bring that all back together so it's one single cell. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to make my column A say num. That tells Blackboard that this is a numeric calculated question. If I wanted multiple choice, I'd put MC there. The next column of information needs to be the text of the question. So I need to get all those cells I had back together in one. And there's a couple different ways to do this. The simplest one, at least in the newer versions of things, is an equation called concatenate. So concatenate, and what I want to do is concatenate all of those columns, and so now it comes back and it's got the text, the numbers, all the way through. The next column needs to be the correct answer. And then the last column is the tolerance. So now what I can do is I can copy this row and paste down however many rows I want, and I've created that many versions of the question. Alright, so that's done. Now I have to get this back out into a text file so that I can bring it into Blackboard. And what I've found the best thing to do is to just copy that range. So I'll copy that, make a new sheet, and just paste the values. It locks the numbers for me now. And then what I'll do is save this as a tab separated values. Okay. Let's save the file. And now if I go and open said file, open it in Notepad. Depending on whether you've done it from Sheets or you've done it from Excel and exactly what happens, sometimes you'll have extra quotation marks in here. You can use a find and replace to get rid of that, to clean it up. But this one doesn't have them, but I've got my whole list of things here. Looks good. I don't need to make any changes. So from that standpoint then, I can come to Blackboard, I can say upload questions, I'll go find, yeah, now where do I find it?
Is it on the desktop?
Good question.
Documents?
No, they wouldn't make it easy. But
Save as, I'll tell you where to-
yeah, that's what I'm gonna do is do this is reopen it. I'm just gonna throw it on the desktop. So you give it the file name that you want to upload, submit. It wants it.
He wants it.
TXT.
Yeah. So let's see if this will. And there they all are. So now that pool has those 33 versions, iterations, let's say, of that question. It's a lot of steps. I really wish it was cleaner, but we lost that with Angel. But this is a way for us to get around it and be able to do it. You can do multiple choice questions this way as well. Multiple choice questions are a little more cumbersome because you've got more columns that you have to deal with in setting up your formatting. I can certainly show people how to do that if you want to see how to do that. But in a nutshell, this is what you have to go through and do. And as you can see, if I pull up the full text of this question, the HTML coding works. So within the cells in your spreadsheet, it doesn't care, it's just text. But when it comes into Blackboard, it reads it as HTML. Which also means if you want to present students with a table of information, you can just code it within your Excel to create the table. And it will work from there.
Just out of curiosity, see if the HTML of the actual question is
Clean?
clean.
In the past, they have been.
Okay.
Look at that.
In the past, they have been. You know, and you can do subscripts and superscripts and all of that. And you can see on the handout, I started a list of basically HTML code.
Right.
Because not everybody that wants to do this is going to know HTML. So if you want to do this, this is how you do it. And people can just copy and paste and grab and go from there. To give you an example of some of the things that we've done, or that I've done, this was a question that we did in Angel and really, really liked, and what drove me to figure out how to do this, because we wanted to get this kind of a question to students. And the way this works is, this is the variable that the problem finds, but it's the answer the students have to actually give you. And there's different exponents for each of these that's random from 0 to 3, and all of these values below the first row depend on things in the first row and depend on this answer. And so there was a lot of dependent variables in this kind of a question that there's no way Blackboard was going to do. But you can code this up with Excel or a spreadsheet with the random function, random number generator, and all the calculations. And the nice thing is, you just keep using columns. You can use the columns to give you stepwise calculations instead of trying to write it all as one long equation. You calculate part and then calculate the next. Because then all you need is to pull the final answer over to be included in the text file.
And it makes it easier for you to troubleshoot.
Yep.
If you do that.
So that's the process in a nutshell. I have encountered one hurdle today that with that split function, it's like once you've split it, you need to save it as text. After that, well, okay. And if you, it's probably best to use a text editor to write your equations so that you don't have any kind of formatting issues that come over from Word or some word processor. Just write it in text. And getting started, my best advice is A, start simple. B, write everything out on paper first, and then start building it up into the text file and into the Excel file and look at things stepwise. The other thing I like about this method is you can do it without being logged into Blackboard. You can sit at any spreadsheet and write questions this way and bring them over. And the nice thing is, if all you're doing is changing values, you get it written once, copy and paste. You're done.
And it's especially nice because if you do start writing a question in Blackboard and you have to stop for some reason, Blackboard doesn't let you stop. I mean,
You can't save a partial
you can't
question.
save part of a question. You're writing the question, you're writing the question.
So you
Or you
finish
lose it.
Right, you finish it, lose it.
Yeah.
Right. So, any questions? Anything that you could think of that I should be sure to add?
Well, I wonder if, you know, as we roll this out as a tutorial, is it helpful for context if we could go backwards and actually demo what the, this was the algorithmic question, right? As opposed to the calculated question, I never could keep those straight.
This is calculated as
This is
opposed to
calculated.
formula.
But in Angel, this was the.
We call them
it
algorithmic.
was
Algorithmic.
question.
Yep,
Yeah.
algorithmic.
And really the calculated formula question, that's the algorithmic question.
Right.
It's just that they treat it differently
Exactly.
between the two platforms.
Because I think, you know, what you're trying, if you don't have the context to understand that you are trying to mimic previous functionality, you know, what are you trying to do? You're trying to solve a gap.
And I think the biggest gap is the number of dependent variables.
Right.
Really, that's the big gap.
Yeah.
And I think I have that written as a white paper. The reasons why you need more than one dependent variable, and I think I included that some in the grant. And so that's your including that as the intro
Right.
or preface document.
Right, the context of what gap we're trying to solve. I mean,
Yep.
You did articulate at the beginning that the major limitation is one dependent variable, and you're trying to write equations that essentially generate on the fly based on multiple dependent variables.
Yep.
That's the problem statement, so.
Okay.
That's what I'm good at, man. You're good at chemistry, and I'm good at mumbo jumbo.
Anything else come to mind before I stop recording? We can talk more, I don't care. I don't think there's another class in here either, but.
What's the difference between concatenate and concat? I don't know, I'm just asking.
I don't know, was that an option?
It was.
It was an option.
Let me do this first. I'm gonna stop this. Sound reasonable?
Yes.
Yeah, and I just asked because I saw it pop up as